Welcome to Rogue Frequencies. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Matt.
And we talk about punk music and culture, but not always in the way you would expect. We are using all things punk as a way to learn more about individual and collective human growth and development. As always, our disclaimer. We are creating distinctive groupings to reflect on human experiences and self-discovery. Our groupings are not meant to be the definitive, all-inclusive categorizations, but simply give us a shared frame of reference to articulate concepts. So today, we are talking about punk as political statement, or political punk, as we will shorthand it. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you to do what you do best as our resident historist. Give us some history and context on punk as a response to the current culture and events.
I think punk at its core has always been a response to the sociocultural, socioeconomic, and political issues of its time. So if you go back to the 1970s when punk first emerges, we see there's this intersection of those three elements, sociocultural, socioeconomic, and political, in the music of bands like the MC5, the Stooges, Patti Smith, and Richard Hell, all of whom are probably best described as proto-punk musicians or artists or groups. However, what they all have in common is this critique of the various forces in their lives that are impacting the art that they are creating. And so right from the beginning, we see baked into the punk movement this reality that punk rock is doing the forever artistic tableau of holding its mirror up to society and reflecting back that what it wants it to see. I think one of the differences with punk, though, was that at its core also was this idea that punk was meant to be offensive. Legs McNeil, one of the early punks as an identity. He was part of the magazine Punk, who documented a lot of this early scene in an oral history called Please Kill Me, which for anybody who wants to know more about early punk, that's a must read, who says like basically all punk was meant to be was something to piss off grownups. Really and truly, it wasn't supposed to have a political identity. The reality, though, is if you are confronting the sociocultural, socioeconomic conditions of your life, you necessarily have to be in confrontation with the political structures that support the society, right? So without sounding too much like Lenin in 1917, there is just no way to disassociate the art and the movement of punk with the political ethos of the artists and the consumers, the punks themselves. And this really comes into a sharp focus in England in the late 1970s with bands like the Clash, the Little Fingers, Sham 69, or one of the bands that we're going to highlight here today, Crass. And all of these are working class bands, working class kids who are looking at the conditions of their lives under Thatcher in England and saying to themselves, like, I want more than this. I deserve more than this life. But if I'm going to get what I think I deserve, I'm going to have to come into conflict with the greater society. And that means political confrontation. And I think that we can really read this out in the ethos of early punk as well, which was definitely meant to be not just confrontational, but done in a confrontation in a way that was supposed to be generative of something that was more humanizing. So a lot of what we see in political punk comes from the left. There's a left orientation on our political spectrum that comes out of, I think, for lack of a better term, the hippie movement of the 1960s, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but Penny Rimbaud talks a lot about this in his work, The Last of the Hippies, and the oral history of Crass breaks this down in particular, this idea that being a true hippie meant having these true values of love and care for other people, not having these conformist ideals where people needed to be put into regimented boxes or structures. At the same time, that we're all looking at our own individual needs and identities and desires, we also are connected to one another. So there's going to be a communal nature to punk. And that really starts to break through back in the United States in the 1980s, where you have the punks against movement. And there's this broad arrayment of mainly hardcore bands, some bands that we highlighted in our New York hardcore scene, some other bands that we haven't talked about so much. A great example would be Reagan Youth, which is a shot at Hitler Youth and Ronald Reagan. So it kind of gives you an idea of the politics right on the sleeve of that band. But the Punks Against movement was kind of characterized with punks against Reagan, radiation, racism, the right, repression, registration, recession, all the alliterations that you can come up with, that still kind of hit to this day right now. And this idea that what punk rock was going to be was it was going to be against dispossession. It was going to be against oppression. In order to fight that fight, you're going to have to be working with other people. And that's where we could pull in another element of punk that we've talked a lot about, the DIY ethic in the zines. You can't just have like rebellion in your basement. You can't have rebellion in your headphones. You can't have rebellion in the garage. It's important to have all of those individual elements of rebellion, but you have to be serving something greater, something more than just yourself. And this is really kind of characterized in the zine culture, and maybe no zine caught it better than Tim Johannen's Maximum Rock and Roll. And Tim Johannen is an interesting figure, somewhat of a gatekeeper figure in punk. But I think, coming from the hippie movement, just like Penny Rimbaud, he had his fingers on the pulse of what punk should actually be. And if I can quote him here, he says, "If punk is to be a threat, different from society, then any so-called punk who flirts with racism and sexism, proudly displays ignorance, resorts to physical violence, and is afraid of knowledge or political action is not a threat at all, but has gone over to the enemy. It is the ideas behind the music, the dress, the zines that are important, not the leather-clad bands and haircuts," end quote. And I think what Timyo is getting at here is this idea that punk isn't nihilistic. Punk isn't about nothing. All those 80s movies who make the punks the bad guys, all the Phil Donahue fear-mongering of punk rock and roll was a mischaracterization of the punk rock movement. And it was a way of displacing, I think, broader anxieties within society that people were feeling onto some sort of other, some sort of demonized other. And I think that the way punk was characterized in the 1980s, because of the aesthetic of punk, like undercut what punk was actually trying to do. So you have the punks who understand that they are working together to have a authentic, abrasive confrontation with society, but not from a place that was just hollowed out and devoid of any meaning. And the two bands that we're going to use to center our discussion here today, the aforementioned Crass out of England, and then Boston's own Dropkick Murphys, really do a great job of being, emblematic or totemic of this punk as more than just the music, punk as more than just the scene, and through their music, through their message, seek to create new conversations with society that are relevant for their time. So Crass in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and the Dropkick Murphys through the 90s, and then resurgently here in 2025, dropping what I personally think is their best album since at least 2005, maybe even going back a little bit more with their offering For the People. So those are going to be the bands that we're going to talk about, and we're just going to have to keep in mind this idea that punk is full of dualities, if you will, more than one duality for sure. I don't know the right word. Pluralities. There's the word I'm looking for. But because of this, I think it offers a really interesting way of looking at the different ways we are plural as individuals as well.
I appreciate setting that context for us, Matt. And I did not interrupt you with a woo woo when you introduced the Dropkick Murphys, Boston's own.
That had to be hard for you.
It was really hard for me to not interrupt. As a native New Englander, went to UMass, and I actually came up into my young adulthood in the time where Boston was creating this big resurgence, this big identity, moving particularly in the Red Sox era from the lovable losers to the great underdogs that then defeated the evil empire, if I might, the New York
Oh, there's
Yankees.
probably, yeah, there's something there with that. Yeah.
And sorry to all of our friends out there that might be New York fans. I still love you, but the rivalry's real. So I have a really strong identity here. But identity aside, and my younger version of myself aside, I would love for you to give us a little taste of how these bands grew into their own and shifted over time in this context of political punk.
Sure. I think what both these bands have in common, and the seed that they're both born from, is a really strong identification with uh, working class individuals. Crass talks a lot about this. Penny Rimbaud talks a lot about this in both The Last of the Hippies and in the Oral History of the Crass, which is a source that we'll link in the show notes that I read about a year ago that really broke down, Crass as more than just band. And Dropkick Murphys, it's all over their early albums, Do or Die in particular, but The Gang's All Here. Their early work is really emblematic of a working class ethos within the band itself, but also the people who are supposed to be consuming the music. And when we say working class, we're talking about in the 70s, the hollowed out labor movement and the quickly degenerating conditions of labor in England. Crass is writing music during very violent strikes where strikers and coal miners are being engaged in what almost looks like medieval battle. The internal elements of many of the major cities in England are beginning to be hollowed out. And it's in these hollowed out, really depressed, in all iterations of that word, elements of England that Crass comes to the fore and says, like, hey, look, things are bad, but we can make things better by working with each other. And where we might have had a labor movement before, we can now replace to a degree the connections that labor created for individual groups of individuals and groups through music and through the scene that we create. And so Crass is out there at the forefront of this anarcho-punk movement. There's obviously all sorts of different interpretations of Crass. Is Crass a punk band? Is Crass some sort of communal hippie sort of band? How authentic was Crass as a punk band? I don't think we need to get into any of that, because what Crass was doing is what mattered most. And what Crass was doing was creating a consciousness, a political consciousness, a social consciousness, an economic consciousness for people to engage with society, specifically in this instance being against Margaret Thatcher. And I think the Dropkick Murphys are coming from that same place. Boston in the 90s, dealing with the financialization of the American economy, the alterations to production patterns. Boston's had a very strong labor history, and the Dropkick Murphys are very conscious about their place in this labor history, and a lot of the music that they're making is reflective of both the historical elements of the labor movement, but also emblematic of the toughness, the ruggedness of Boston as a city, the neighborhoods in Boston as these cohesive units. And I think what the Dropkick Murphys are a band that is almost personifying an ethos of the city. And that ethos, I think, really draws from this scrappy working class identity that Boston holds up as such a core element of what it is. And so I think that that's where these bands come from. They come from this place of the labor movement and being connected to other people. And that's what labor is, right? The labor movement is a self-conscious identification with your brothers in labor, your sisters in labor, the people with whom you create with. And I think as the labor movement starts to disappear in the West, we see punk rock taking up the mantle of that connectivity and doing so in a way that was supposed to be confrontational. So it's almost this like generative transgression that starts to take hold in both of these bands and both of the places that these bands come out of.
Yeah, that's really helpful to hear the consistencies between two very different places and times. And it harkens back to New York hardcore, where we see that come out of a similar climate in New York City. So while these cities have their own identities and this is happening at slightly different times, we still see similar movements come out of them with slightly different manifestations based on identity.
Yes.
Context matters, right? So there's some similarities of the context, and then there's some subtle differences that shape these bands to be slightly different, and especially with the differentiations we're making here.
Yes. Yeah. I think that both those bands are very authentic to where they came from. And I think that's why they hit for so many people is that they're not playing at something. They are just representative of who and they are and where they are. And I think that um, any of us who consume art, whatever the medium, that authenticity really matters. And I think that's what makes these bands impactful is that they are easy to identify with because they're not putting on airs. And I think that that's something that also makes them very attractive. You can see yourself in them if you want to. And I think they're self-consciously, both those bands are playing with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you and I have spoken about this over time, we've talked about this story arc of the Dropkick Murphys
Yes.
and how the authenticity looks different at different times, places, and spaces for this band. Can you give us a little bit of that arc and we can maybe talk about that a little bit more, that how authenticity might shift over time?
Sure. I think we'll go into the Matt vault for this one because I think my experience with the band kind of is how I view their arc. And so, like I said before, they become a band in 1996, and in the beginning, they're a Boston band. It's very obvious. They're not holding that part back. They're very much drawing from the Irish history of Boston, which is emblematic of where they came from. But they were a punk rock band, and so me as this like kid out in Denver in my teens, right at the beginning of my high school years, I could listen to the Dropkick Murphys, and then later when they came to Denver and I started to go to those shows early on, you could participate with this band that like I'm not Irish, I'm not from Boston, I didn't grow up in a working class household, I didn't grow up with the labor movement ideals. I'm not a red diaper baby, right? I'm none of those things, but I could still very easily vibe with the Dropkick Murphys because they were a punk rock band, and so the pit, the attitude, the sound, the tone, the rhythm, all of those things was so familiar, and their first arc of albums are all these very punk rock albums. They're all very much of their time. Dropkick Murphys is a Hellcat band, so there's this connection to Tim Armstrong and the type of punk music that Rancid and Bad Religion over at Epitaph were really trying to platform in the mid and late 90s. And so it was a very easy inroad, and things started to change for the Dropkick Murphys, in my opinion anyway, in 2004. And that's when your Red Sox finally break through, break the curse, and win the World Series. And there's this huge cultural moment where Boston was kind of the epicenter of the American identity. It had been centered on New York post 9/11 for obvious reasons. And then there's the Red Sox breaking through, and there's this kind of underdog moment. There's something that's fun and light and airy about the way the Red Sox won. And I don't have to tell you that Red Sox team was emblematic of the city in the same way that the Dropkick Murphys was emblematic of the city. It wasn't always pretty. It didn't always sound great, for the band, for the baseball team. It wasn't always pretty. It didn't always look the way baseball maybe should look, but there was this grinding sort of ethos. And I think for that reason, the band and the team saw in each other Boston. And there was this linkage that forms between the band and the baseball team. So I correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I remember there was like the band was at the game, maybe on the field after they win. I think they play like Tessie or something like that after they win, and there's this big celebration of Boston breaking through baseball wise, but also for the city. It's a celebration for the city, and the Dropkick Murphys are a part of that. And then, that's in October 2004. June 2005, they dropped Warriors Code, and Shipping Up to Boston is this breakout song. It's in movies, it's on, the late night shows, you can hear it on the radio. It becomes transcendent. And I think that post 2005, they do another album in 2007, The Meanest of Times, where you start to see it more, because 2005's Warriors Code is still the type of punk that Dropkick had been doing up to, from their beginning, that first 10 years. 2007's The Meanest of Times starts to become more of this like Boston affinity band. And I think throughout the aughts, at the end of the aughts and into the teens, each new album that the Dropkick Murphys puts out is more linked to the Boston identity than it is to the punk rock identity. And that doesn't mean that the tropes and the ideas that the band has been playing with disappeared, but it became a lot more difficult for me to see myself in that music. And I go to shows and they would feel different. The people who were at the shows were different. And we're not gatekeeping punk, right? Like everybody should show up to a punk rock show and have fun. But also the band, the people there, that they interact with each other in a different way, and everything felt much more mellow and subdued. And that definitely started to change after the pandemic, after the first Trump administration, where the Dropkick Murphys start to find, I think, themselves again. Now, the way the music sounds, the some of the lyrical content is still very Boston affinity-y. However, they start to really get back to, I think, what made Dropkick Murphys. They do a couple of Woody Guthrie albums where they cover Woody Guthrie songs. And then this year, just, within, as we were sitting down getting ready to record, they drop For the People, which I think is their best album, like I said, since the early 2000s. I think it's very easy to listen to that one and be like, yeah, no, that's the Dropkick Murphys. And it also coincides with them very publicly breaking with Punk in the Park because of the politics of the show promoters, who had been MAGA donors, and very public confrontations with the Trump administration, Trump boosters. And the band has very self-consciously leaned into their political identity again, and also retained the Boston side of things. And so there's I think they're back to their truest form of themselves. And all versions of Dropkick are fun, right? But I think this version that right here and now in 2025, I think this is the one that I can look at and say like, oh, there they are. I see you again, right? Because I think they're back to that place.
Matt's labor union stripes are showing.
Yeah, a little bit, right? Kind of like bleeding red through a little bit here.
I'm glad you said bleeding through. In an interesting transition here. So with the authenticity that we're talking about, we see the Dropkick Murphys move through leading with various identities that are all authentic to them, at least initially.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of speculate that maybe some of the energy is lost, that by leaning into the super Boston identity over time, maybe starts to wear a little old and a little thin, because potentially their strongest and truest identity is the ethos, is the core values they hold about community, communal nature, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So the bloody intersection is one of the signature moments for the Red Sox is Curt Schilling and his bloody sock.
Ah, I remember that.
Yeah, he gets stitched up in his ankle. I can't quite remember, something with his Achilles.
Right.
So painful. So he gets stitched up and he goes out on the mound and crushes it and wins that game. the authenticity of he's bleeding through his socks, it's a visual representation of the authenticity in the same way that Dropkick and Crass are audio versions of authenticity.
Yeah.
And we think about, and I'm sorry to wax poetic about early 2000s baseball for far too long. I think it's the same thing, though, with Jonathan Papelbon, the epic Red Sox closer. For a short number of years, he was the hottest closer in baseball. But it wasn't just because he could strike people out and close games, which was pretty awesome. He was incredibly expressive.
Yes, I
And that
remember him. Yeah, on the mound, the screaming, the fist pumps, the chest, thumping, all that sort of stuff, in a way that was confrontational.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very punk. It was different. Baseball, all sports have a little bit of showmanship to them. Football has a lot. We'll save that for another conversation.
right.
But before that, baseball was a little more buttoned up, and especially if you contrast that with the New York Yankees under Steinbrenner,
Hmm.
pinstripes, no beards, hair length was a thing. They were meant to represent the business person of New York. They were
Sure.
the most buttoned up of all of baseball.
Well, yeah, they think of Derek Jeter during that time period as the perfect avatar of this very cold, calculated professionalism, and like that's to say nothing of the greatness of Derek Jeter, but there was an aesthetic difference for sure.
Yes, and what happened with the Red Sox at this time, which also brings Dropkick Murphys along at this time, is there's this deep, gritty underdog nature, and it reads so authentic. That people are pulled in and drawn in. I mean, you also get, oh my gosh, I can't believe I can't remember his name. Johnny Damon with is that his last name?
Yep.
Anyway, with the long hair,
Yeah, yeah, playing center field.
very, very juxtaposed as these two arch rival teams, from clean cut, poised, chiseled, buttoned up, to we're a bunch of misfit ragtag guys out here who are expressive and authentic, and we're bleeding just like you bleed. And as you mentioned, Boston becomes a little bit of the epicenter of the American identity because of this authenticity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really important. I think people need to be able to see themselves as they are in what they're consuming, whether it's baseball or punk rock or whatever it might be. And when you lose the ability to see yourself there, the connection gets severed, and then how you can then progress through like whatever the art or whatever it is, it just doesn't feel the same, right? And I think like Crass is a really good example of this, where early Crass, like the Feeding of the 5,000, that album and those songs, like Crass is very much like this idea of like everybody's going to be center stage. We're all going to wear black. We're all going to have the lighting be on all of us. It's not going to be on the lead singer. We're all going to be very communal, which is, coming out of their communal living situation makes a lot of sense. Fast forward a couple years to an album like Penis Envy, where I think Crass has lost its crassness. And so what I mean by that is, in the early albums, whether it's the Feeding of the 5,000 or Stations of the Cross or Stations of the Crass, excuse me. I'm not Catholic, but that's the trope play, and it totally just caught me on that one. But in any rate, like those albums feature everybody in the band. They feature a plethora and plurality of identities. Crass has male and female singers. They have musicians that are self-taught. Like there's this art noise element to Crass in a lot of ways. By the time you get to Penis Envy, Crass is trying to create a space that's more inclusive and platforming a female identity. And so Penis Envy puts to the fore their female members of the band. And, Steve Ignorant, who I guess could be termed the lead singer of the early albums, he kind of moves to the back, and he says in the oral history, like, I felt like I wasn't doing anything. Like, am I even in this band anymore? Does it even matter? Are we doing something for what we believe? Or are we doing something because this is what people want us to do? And I think that the Dropkick Murphys kind of, like, I don't want to call it a trap, but I think that they found themselves in that same place of making music that people wanted, and so doing, maybe not having behind it the same sort of force, the same sort of soul that's there. And I think in the case of both bands, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that they were hollow. I'm not saying that they sold out. I'm not saying that, we're not going to do the punk rock gatekeeper thing that I have said on the pod I despise so much. But there's also something true here that the band just wasn't the same in either instance when there was this movement away from that authenticity, that thing that people could look at and say, like, oh, Crass is me, I am Crass. Or Dropkick comes out to Denver in the late 90s and I get in the pit and I'm like, yeah, no, this is so much fun. And it doesn't matter that I've never been to Boston. Even to this day, I still can identify with all of these elements of what they're talking about, these Boston-based elements, because they're speaking a truth that's transcendent.
Yeah, I appreciate how you connected here the transcendency with the read the room.
Hmm.
And one of the things you and I have talked about is how bands shift and how we as humans can shift based on how we read the room, the context of where we are. And we see these bands shift and change based on context. So Crass recognizes there's something changing in their evolution as a band by which they need to reorder their band members to stay with their authenticity. They're not a female band. They're not a male band. They're a co-ed band, and that can look different at different times. I think about my years playing ultimate frisbee in co-ed, that there are 7 players on a field, and when it's co-ed, it can be 4-3 ratio men to women or 3-4 men to women based on the context of how you want to play the game in any particular play. So we see this band doing this here. They're shifting not because it's inauthentic to shift. It's actually the most authentic thing you can do because you're looking at the context and you're adapting your own multitudes to best fit the context of the time. So we see that with Crass here in a way that allows them to shift in a way that reads maybe hyper-authentic. What we see with the Dropkick Murphys, as we are interpreting it, as it's not inauthentic. They're doing what they're genuinely called to do, but they might be overly leaning into one particular identity, the Boston identity, because it brought with it a draw of notoriety and fame. And again, it's not a trap, but they're reading the room going, people want this. We can feel it. It's palpable. Our fans love us. Our fan base is growing. Our music is being disseminated in new ways. Let's lean into this opportunity. And I will say, maybe becomes a little stale or doesn't feel energetically with the same authenticity. And then we see them move back into the pandemic and the unrest that created socially. And now in these certain political times having a similar feel, Dropkick Murphys have a new energy to them, not because they have shifted who they are, but because they're leaning into different evolutions of their own authentic nature over time. And as you and I talked about prior to this recording, and we've talked about for a while now, is this idea of I, you, and thou. And thou is the honoring of the self with the commitment to the collective. And this shift from the Dropkick Murphys and this way of being of Crass to us are emblematic of the most clear ways of the embodiment of thou in punk music.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, like, one of the things that is, like, when I hear you talking about the idea of the thou, I get back to this idea of the labor movement and that connectivity. And again, like, labor isn't just economic. I know we think about it sometimes as economic, but, like, labor is really about political power. It's about coming together, right? Unionization, the collective, the association, the utilization of the idea of solidarity, a debt that we all owe each other and pay together. That's what solidarity is. And both bands, whether it's Crass working with the anarcho movement of the early 1980s and trying to feed and house people in an authentic sort of way, or Dropkick Murphys right now, I think if anybody like who's like, oh, maybe I don't know, I'm not familiar with that band, but they sound familiar, it's probably because of the confrontations Ken Casey's had with fans of the band who also show up wearing MAGA gear. Right. And so very famously, over the last couple of months, there have been these national viral video clips of Ken Casey making a bet with a fan that like, hey, I bet you, X amount of dollars that like I'm more for America than you. And the guy's like, no, I'm MAGA. I've got the MAGA hat. And Casey's like, yeah, the shirts that we sell, these are made in America by American laborers. Your hat comes from, this other country. It's not for America. And this idea that what Casey's leaning into here, I think is really authentically him. I don't think he needs to play anything up. I think he's just that return to form for him, that confrontation that punk is, that conversation with society that we've talked about before, really and truly like shines through here. And it's because Dropkick is standing for the people, right? I mean, it's right there in the name of the album, right? It's like, we're not even gonna play with it, but even like the symbology there of like the symbol on the front of that album cover is a rose, and that's really in conversation with the socialist movement. It's all out in the open. It's in front. And all of those things, labor, socialism, punk rock, what do all of these things have in common? It's the community of people. And it's why, in the only time that I think that you can ever like look at punk and say like, yeah, there needs to be some gatekeeping, there needs to be some protection. And I know it's something we'll talk a lot more about when we get into feminist punk, is this idea of kind of policing the scene for elements that shouldn't be there. And whether that be like, Nazis and far right actors who are a huge element of the punk scene in the 80s and 90s that, it's still there today. Or it's like these kind of like edgelordy internet troll type of individuals who like have co-opted the term or the idea that I'm being punk rock, right? And I'm being punk rock because I'm breaking things and I'm moving fast, that like Silicon Valley sort of thing. And like, no, because if you go back to the Tim Yohannan thing that we talked about before, like what is driving your action that you are calling punk? Well, it's this exclusive, destructive, sexist, misogynistic, hollowed out version of the individual. And punk rock has always had in this tension, this idea of like, who am I? How do I see myself in society? That like ego-driven element that you've talked like really eloquently about before, but also then like, how do I connect to others? Right. And that's where the political element is really important, because politics is something you do with other people. You don't do politics by yourself. You can't. Right. It's impossible. And that's where these bands are so important to our story, because they also recognize that like what they're doing is communal in nature.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I got really excited about how you brought in the recent confrontations that have been happening between the Dropkick Murphys and MAGA. And what is interesting about the story arc is we can't know where the story is going that we are a part of in the moment. And in some ways, you could say the Dropkick Murphys needed to have this era where they were non-political or less political and leaned into their Boston identity to grow their following, to have more credibility, more of a following, to be most utilitarian in this time, place, and space when we are having this political crisis. And as I think about this story arc, it's actually changing in my mind right now in real time as we're talking about it, because I believe we can't know the universe's purpose for us in the moment, but later it can become much more clear, especially if we are living and leading with our deepest authenticity. And we see this band moving through time, and maybe some people, like we've talked about, might call it their quote sellout era or whatever. But really, they had a purpose at that time. And that's where Dropkick Murphys got famous as famous, however we define that, but they got much more notoriety and fame. And now they have an opportunity to platform in a way they would not have had otherwise. And they're using it. And that is punk.
Yes.
Using your sticks and your rocks and your torn up t-shirts and jacket, using what you have to make the most of this opportunity and the future opportunities. So when I think about what levers are sort of, we all get to choose what levers we're pulling at different times within us internally, and then how we actualize in the world. That's where we have agency. And so I think about this idea that music, all art, but in this case, punk music, has to be consumable while also being nonconformist. That's the juxtaposition of punk, the dichotomies of punk. Has to be able to be consumed. If it can't be consumed, then it doesn't serve its purpose, but also the tension to not conform within punk. And what we see in Crass and what we see in Dropkick Murphys in these sort of bookend years as we're talking about it is confrontation first, consumable as an underlying supporting factor to get it heard. And there's a comparison here with pop punk, which one could say is consumable first, and the confrontation is more hidden. And you are much more expert at the history and the ways this plays out than I am. So I'd love to hear you share with us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think we can just go to a band that everybody knows because it's a band that came out of the punk rock scene that becomes like the pop punk band of all time. I don't think that that's a statement you can argue against. And we're talking about Green Day. It's like right there in the name of the band, right? There's this very overt environmental political statement. This band that comes out of this small scene that we talked about with Rancid, the 924 Gilman scene and the East Bay, and through happenstance, through just the authenticity of their art, they break through in 94 with Dookie, and they become this band that is really the leading edge and has been the leading edge for, I think, mainstream America to view punk rock in a lot of ways. I think that there's the transgressive punk, which we'll talk about what our thoughts on transgressive punk and where that transgression actually lies, which is, I think, in terms of a hierarchy, much, much further down in a hierarchy. But I think there's like the pop punk, which is like, Green Day, or another band that everybody knows, maybe the other band that might be on the forefront of everybody's mind when they think about pop punk, Blink-182, right? And these are definitely punk rock bands. They are pop punk bands. They both these bands have things that they care about and things that they speak towards, political, environmental, Blink-182 in the mental health space. Like, there's a lot of substance to these bands, but the thing that I think makes a lot of punk rock people cringe when they think about Green Day or Blink is that they see the wrapping paper first and they don't see what's under it, because this is how the band presents itself. Right. I read an article in preparation for this, and the author of the article, this guy Wong, he talks about this idea. It's really hard to be overtly punk when your band is teaming up with 7-Eleven to make a signature flavor, right? And that's Green Day. And so, like, yeah, there's this element to it, and I'm sure, like, someone like a punk rock purist like Ian Mackay from Fugazi and Minor Threat would point out, like, well, all bets are off because your art is being sold first, and as a result of that, there's no authenticity there. And I don't think Mackay's wrong about that. I also think that it's unfair to Green Day and Blink-182 and other pop punk bands to say that they are totally devoid of any meaning, that they don't have anything there when it comes to their first principles. And that's what, Crass and Dropkick Murphys and the New York hardcore guys and the Clash and Rancid and these bands that we've already talked about, they all have first principles and that they derive their art from that space. And whether it's friendship, whether it's a DIY mentality, whether it's a confrontation with society or a deep underlying feeling that the political nature of our reality is rotten. All of these bands have something they draw from first, and then they make their music second, and then people consume it third. And I think that the order of operations has flipped with those pop punk bands. And so we think about them differently as a result.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And the ordering changes what we see or how we may or may not feel about them. But at the same time, when we think about pop punk, they have much bigger platforms
Hmm.
to then share the message. So you can consume those without the message, but there are more people that the message can get to versus staying in sort of the middle of notoriety in the punk world, which I would say is probably right around where Dropkick is, where there might be less people, but you're leading with the message first. So I think I would think of them as different delivery modes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes you drink your beverage in a can, sometimes you drink it in a bottle, sometimes you drink it with a straw. It's just different delivery methods.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right about that. And I think that, it matters to a great degree to some punk rock people, like which bands you listen to, where you're getting the message from, and whether or not it's authentic as a result. And so there's this idea of there's pop punk and then there's entry level punk and then there's like underground punk and hardcore and the subgenres of punk. And the deeper you get into it, the more authentic the punk rock becomes. And I don't think that that's necessarily true in a lot of ways. I think you can look at some of the underground punk stuff, and you can look at some of the stuff that's definitely not as mainstreamed and things that the average person, even people who are fans of punk, might not know about certain bands, to say that like, oh, those are the real punk rock bands because they're crust punk or they're gutter punk or whatever. Does that really mean that those bands have a better message or they're more authentic? And not necessarily. Like some of those bands are very nihilistic in nature. I think anybody who wants to kind of look at the difference between the hollowed out sort of ethos of some of that crust punk, gutter punk scene versus some of the 80s stuff that we talked about before, the punks against scene, needs to just go watch the third iteration of Decline of Western Civilization, which is oriented on the street punk, crust punk community. And it's a very hard watch because it's very nihilistic. And we started all of this off by saying that political punk is by definition not nihilistic. It stands for something and it wants to move towards something. And I think that it's really dangerous to dismiss certain bands because of how you consume them, right? Like you said, the vehicle of consumption. Um, it, there's more. Like we've said so many times with punk, it is so much more complex than what I think we want it to be, and I think that sometimes is unsettling for some people to hear.
Humans are more complex than we want them to be.
Facts.
And I think this brings up us to our natural wrap up point that authenticity does not lie in the packaging. It lies within the contents inside. And doing the work internally to the self, doing the work internally to the band, doing the introspection, the reflection, the reprioritization of the multitudes allows us then to live out a more authentic way of being. And something that I've been talking to folks a lot about lately, it's actually one of my signature speaking talks, is this idea that we are in the age of authenticity. That previously we were in the age of credibility, where your degree mattered, you wearing the right business suit, and the male and female version that represents the certain male or female birthed body. Certain, for women, the earrings match the shoes. For men, the very particular style of shoes with their business gear. Your the places you worked mattered, how long you worked there mattered, your credentials, your degrees, your certificates, on and on and on. We were in this age of credibility, and we have shifted. And we can see this. I did not expect this to be a semi-baseball podcast
I
today.
know it's like a Ken Burns sort of thing broke out in this one.
We're getting close to Ken Burns' length today
Yeah,
as
totally.
well. But we see this epic battle happen with the Red Sox and the Yankees. The Yankees being that credibility looking a certain way, performing baseball a certain way in the aesthetics, and the Red Sox being kind of the rough underdogs. We see this play out in other things around the late 1990s into the early 2000s, and we get birthed into this age of authenticity. And some of what cracks it open is also the pandemic, where we all realized we could go to work in our sweatpants. It's the shirt that mattered, not the pants anymore. And now our dress is even more casual than it was before, which was already trending casual.
Mhm.
It reads as more authentic. And this shift is also illustrated by Harvard Business School, that does a study every year on what are the top traits people are looking for in leaders. And the top traits that have been emerging over the last 5 or so years that are super strong and have not, they've taken hold and have not broken, are authenticity, transparency, and reliability. That's what people are looking for in leaders of any type. And just today, as we are recording today, which we could not have seen happening when we started having these conversations a year and a half ago-ish,
Right.
maybe a little over a year ago, today is a No Kings protest here in the U.S., the second one, I believe,
Yep.
where this is all about the authenticity of people being in the streets and speaking out against a conformity,
Mhm.
a political conformity that is happening. It's not just politically we're seeing it everywhere, from wearing sweatpants to our political climate. And the age of authenticity allows us an opportunity to be authentic with ourselves and the world in a new way, in a reinvented way that allows us to fulfill this thou idea. By
Mhm.
being authentic to myself and you being authentic to me, we can build greater community. We can heal, hopefully, ourselves in more real ways to move forward together with a siblinghood of we are in this together.
Totally. Totally. I
Which
love
is, I
that.
would say, what Crass shows us, if not anything, of this super egalitarian, socialist feeling band.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's right there in their symbol, right? Like the Crass symbol is everything and nothing all at once, right? And I think that um that connection piece, and as I think we are moving towards our close here and we put a pin in it, it's part of the reason why, again, when we talk about like these bands and what they stand for and the connection, why, the people who want to show up at shows or who want to work in finance where they're pumping financial vehicles that rob people of their health care or their ability to house themselves, or forcing people into hard decisions about which bills to be paid, or forcing people to accept living in optimal conditions in any society, right? Those same people who show up to a punk rock show and then want to sing along with the lyrics, or mouth out the power chords, because more often than not, those guys don't know the words to the songs, because if they did, they'd realize that the hypocrisy of what they are and who they are, like they're engaging in like performative transgression, right? And we said at the beginning, this is, political punk is generative transgression. You stand against something, but at the same time, you stand for something else. And I think that, the people that, I personally think that should be purged from any scene are the people who don't want to spend the time to consume the art, the content in a reflective manner, and then look at their own actions, what they stand for, and ask themselves, hey, is this art me? Am I it? Right. And I think that's the area that we should be most concerned with. It's not the Green Days or the Blink 182s or how deep like cut the band is. Like if it's Nausea, if it's Crass, if it's Green Day, if it's standing for something and against something simultaneously in a way that makes people's lives better, that's good. And if it's the Wall Street guy or your neighbor who, shows up to the punk show in, his New Balances and his, Dockers and screams out like, the power chord sound because like, hey, I read in some blog post that, this is, or TikTok or whatever, this is like punk rock and this is cool. Like, not here for you, buddy. Like, no, thank you. Like, you're not welcome here unless you want to actually do the thing that like helps make everybody else better, right? I think one of the things you've talked a lot about with feminist punk, right, is this idea, and I'm gonna, steal your line from the outline here, but it's like that idea of I can't change you, but it's my duty to try to make change for the better, right? If you're not going to make change for the better, this isn't a place for you, right? And that I think is gatekeeping that should happen.
Well said. We'll leave that there.
Nice.
And Matt, you mentioned them throughout, but if you just want to drop the name of a couple of the resources that you mentioned, of course, they'll be in the show notes as well.
Yeah. So I checked out an oral history of Crass. I think it's just called Oral History of Crass. I'll put it in the show notes. And then an article that from Current Affairs magazine that I really liked a lot, Why America Still Needs Punk Rock by Grant Wong in Current Affair magazine. I think we can throw up the link for that in the show notes as well. I thought that was a really good, nuanced exploration of punk rock from the 70s right up to the 2000s, and does a good job of creating an entry point, but then also there's some meat on those bones as well.
Wonderful. So with that, this is the end of today's Ken Burns length conversation on growth and life lessons through the lens of political punk. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.